When I was about 14, my friends and I used to hang out at this small arcade in our town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few old machines, a couple of pool tables, and a snack bar. But it was cheap, and it was one of the few places we could go without adults hovering over us. My friends, Ethan, Ryan, and I would go there almost every Friday night after school. It was our little tradition. The arcade was usually packed with kids our age, but there were always a few older people hanging around. Most of them were harmless, just there to play pool or pinball. But there was one guy who always gave us the creeps. He was probably in his late 40s, always wearing the same faded leather jacket and baseball cap. He never seemed to play any games, just wandered around the arcade, watching people. We started calling him Shadow Steve, because he always seemed to be lurking in the background. One Friday night, the arcade was unusually quiet. A lot of kids were at some school event, but the three of us decided to go anyway. When we got there, we noticed Shadow Steve almost immediately. He was sitting at one of the tables near the snack bar, sipping on a soda and staring at us. We tried to ignore him and went to play one of the racing games. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him watching us. After about an hour, Ethan suggested we leave and grab some food at the diner down the street. As we were walking out, I noticed Steve get up and follow us. I whispered to my friends, and we decided to take a longer route to the diner to see if he was really following us. Sure enough, every time we turned a corner, he was there, keeping his distance but never losing sight of us. We finally made it to the diner and sat in a booth near the back. Steve didn't come inside, but we could see him standing across the street, pretending to look at his phone. It was unsettling, but we figured he'd get bored and leave eventually. After about 30 minutes, we decided to head home. Ryan lived the closest, so we walked him to his house first. By the time we got there, Steve was nowhere to be seen, and we started to relax. Ethan and I continued walking toward our neighborhood. It was a quiet night, and the streets were mostly empty. We were joking around, trying to shake off the weirdness of earlier when we heard footsteps behind us. We turned around, and there he was, about 20 feet away, just standing there under a streetlight. He didn't say anything, just stared at us. We froze for a moment, then Ethan whispered, "Run." We took off down the street, sprinting as fast as we could. I could hear his footsteps behind us, getting closer. We turned a corner and ducked into an alley, hiding behind a dumpster. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give us away. We waited there for what felt like forever, but eventually the footsteps faded, and we thought we were safe. Ethan and I decided to split up and head straight home. My house was only a few blocks away, so I ran the rest of the way, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got to my front door, I realized I didn't have my key. My parents were out for the evening, so I had to use the spare key we kept hidden in the backyard. I went around to the back of the house, grabbed the key from under a loose brick, and unlocked the door. As I stepped inside, I felt a presence behind me. Before I could turn around, someone grabbed me and shoved me into the house. A hand clamped over my mouth, and I was pushed against the wall. I struggled, kicking and clawing, and managed to bite the hand covering my mouth. The man let out a grunt of pain and loosened his grip just enough for me to scream. I screamed as loud as I could, hoping one of my neighbors would hear. The man panicked and shoved me to the ground before bolting out the back door. I scrambled to my feet and locked the door behind him. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I ran upstairs to my room and called my parents, who came home immediately and called the police. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They searched the area but didn't find anyone. I never saw Shadow Steve again after that night. But I'll never forget the look in his eyes when he grabbed me. It was the look of someone who had done this before. When I was in high school, my friends and I had a habit of sneaking into places we weren't supposed to be. It wasn't about stealing or vandalizing. We just liked the thrill of exploring the unknown. There were 4 of us: me, Danny, Sarah, and Marcus. We lived in a small town in Pennsylvania where there wasn't much to do, so we made our own fun. Looking back, we were probably just bored kids trying to feel alive. One night, Danny told us about an old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down for decades, and there were rumors about it being haunted. Of course, we didn't believe in ghosts, but the idea of sneaking in sounded exciting. Sarah was hesitant at first, but Marcus and I convinced her it would be fun. Danny, as usual, was the ringleader, always coming up with these crazy ideas. We decided to go on a Friday night. Danny brought a crowbar to pry open any locked doors, and Marcus brought a flashlight. I brought my phone for light, and Sarah brought a small first aid kit, just in case. She was always the cautious one. We parked Danny's old pickup truck a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way to the hospital. The building was massive, with broken windows and ivy crawling up the walls. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The front doors were chained shut, but Danny found a side entrance that was already partially open. The air inside was cold and stale, and the only sounds were our footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The place was a mess, peeling paint, broken furniture, and graffiti everywhere. We wandered through the main floor for a while, joking around and taking pictures. It was creepy, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then we found the stairs leading to the basement. Marcus shined his flashlight down the steps, and we could see the faint outline of a door at the bottom. "Let's check it out," Danny said, already heading down. Sarah hesitated, but I nudged her, and we followed. The basement was even colder than the rest of the building, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. The door at the bottom was slightly ajar, and Danny pushed it open with the crowbar. Inside, we found what looked like an old storage room. There were shelves filled with dusty jars and boxes, and a few broken chairs scattered around. Marcus started poking through the boxes, while Sarah stayed close to the door. I was looking at some old medical equipment when we heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. We all froze. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. "Probably just a rat," Danny said, but even he didn't sound convinced. The tapping continued, growing louder and more rhythmic. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate. Marcus pointed his flashlight toward the far corner of the room, where there was another door. "It's coming from there," he said. "No way," Sarah said, backing toward the stairs. "We should leave." But Danny was already moving toward the door. "Come on, it's probably just the wind or something," he said. He pushed the door open, revealing a long, dark hallway. The tapping stopped. We stood there in silence, staring into the blackness. Then, without warning, the sound started again, this time louder and closer. It was coming from the hallway. "Okay, I'm out," Sarah said, turning to leave. But before she could take a step, the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening bang. We all jumped, and Marcus dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beam flickering. Danny picked it up and shined it down the hallway, but there was nothing there. "Let's just go," I said, my voice shaking. But Danny, being Danny, decided to keep going. "You guys can leave if you want," he said. "I'm checking this out." He started walking down the hallway, and after a moment, Marcus followed. I didn't want to be left alone, so I went after them. Sarah stayed behind, calling after us to come back. The hallway was narrow and lined with doors, most of them closed. The tapping sound had stopped again, but the air felt heavy, like we were being watched. Danny opened one of the doors and stepped inside. It was another storage room, but this one was empty except for a single chair in the middle of the room. The chair was facing the wall, and there was something on it. A bundle of cloth or maybe a coat. Danny walked over to it, and as he reached out to touch it, the chair spun around. Sitting in it was a man, or at least what looked like a man. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless. He stared at us for a moment, then let out a low, guttural growl. We all screamed and bolted for the door. Marcus dropped the flashlight again, and this time it went out completely. We ran blindly down the hallway, bumping into walls and each other. I could hear Sarah screaming from the other room, and when we reached the stairs, she was already halfway up. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" Marcus shouted, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Danny said, looking as pale as the man in the chair. "But we're never coming back here." We piled into the truck and drove away as fast as we could. None of us spoke the entire ride home. To this day, we don't know who or what that man was. The hospital was torn down a few years later, and I've never been back to that part of town. Sometimes I still hear that tapping sound in my dreams and I wake up in a cold sweat. Whatever was in that basement, I hope I never see it again. One evening, my boyfriend Daniel and I decided to have a quiet night at home. We ordered some takeout, opened a bottle of wine, and settled on the couch to watch a movie. It was a calm, uneventful night, and we were both looking forward to just relaxing after a long week. The movie was about halfway through when we heard a faint noise coming from the backyard. It sounded like something metallic being dragged across the ground. Daniel paused the movie and we both sat there, listening. The sound stopped and we brushed it off as maybe a raccoon or some other animal. A few minutes later, the sound came again, this time louder. Daniel got up to check, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen. I followed him to the back door, feeling uneasy. He opened the door and shone the light into the yard, but there was nothing there. The gate was closed, and everything seemed normal. Still, the sound had been so distinct that it left us both feeling unsettled. Daniel locked the door, and we went back to the couch, trying to shake off the weird feeling. About 20 minutes later, we heard another noise, but this time it came from inside the house. It was a soft thud, like something falling over. My heart started racing as we both froze, staring at each other. Daniel whispered that it was probably nothing, but I could see the tension in his face. He grabbed a kitchen knife and motioned for me to stay behind him as we slowly walked toward the hallway where the sound had come from. We checked the bathroom, the guest room, and the laundry room, but everything was in its place. There was no sign of anything unusual. Just as we were about to head back to the living room, we heard another noise, this time from upstairs. It was a creaking sound, like someone walking on the floorboards. My stomach dropped. We didn't have any pets, and no one else was supposed to be in the house. Daniel whispered for me to stay downstairs while he went to check. I didn't want to let him go alone, but he insisted. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, clutching my phone, ready to call the police if anything happened. I watched as he slowly climbed the stairs, the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. He disappeared around the corner, and I held my breath, straining to hear anything. A few seconds later, I heard him call out, "Hello? Who's there?" His voice was shaky, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Then, there was a loud crash, followed by the sound of footsteps running. Daniel came rushing back down the stairs, his face pale. "There's someone up there," he said, grabbing my arm. "We need to get out of here." We ran out the front door and into the driveway, where we called the police. They arrived within minutes, and we explained what had happened. 2 officers went inside to check the house while we waited outside, shivering despite the warm night air. After what felt like an eternity, they came back out and told us they had found someone hiding in the attic. It was a man, disheveled and clearly not in his right mind. He had been living up there for who knows how long, sneaking down when we weren't home to take food and supplies. The officers escorted the man out in handcuffs, and I'll never forget the way he looked at us as they walked him past. His eyes were wild, filled with a mix of anger and confusion. One of the officers told us it was lucky we had called when we did because the man had been carrying a knife. The thought of what could have happened if Daniel had confronted him alone still haunts me. After the police left, we couldn't bring ourselves to go back inside that night. We ended up staying at a hotel, and even now, months later, I still feel uneasy in the house. We've since installed security cameras and made sure every window and door is always locked. But the memory of that night lingers. It's terrifying to think that someone could be living in your home without you even knowing.